Something that figures in pretty prominently into the security model is our old friend, the shared responsibility model. And this figures in because the customer has a lot of responsibilities under this model. From the client-side data to the server-side data, and the networking, all the way up to the data that lives in the customer's applications. Now, there's a pretty core concept of security called the principle of least privileges. That just means that we're going to give users or services only the access they need to do their job and nothing more. And in some cases, we only give it to them when they need it and then take it away when their job's done. Now, there are a few security facets that you should be aware of. First, we have the concept of identity, and that's just really who you are. Examples of this are root account users or IAM users. Then we have authentication. Can you prove that you're who you say you are? And examples of this are multi-factor authentication or maybe a client-side SSL certificate. Then we have authorization. Are you allowed to do this thing? And in AWS, that's implemented in things like IAM policies. Then we also have trust. Do other entities that I trust also trust you? And examples of this are cross-account access or maybe web identity federation. So let's take a look at some typical components of a security setup. First, we have identities. These can be people, objects, other computers. Then we have this concept of an identity provider. Now, inside that identity provider, we usually have an identity store, which stores the identities and maybe some additional information or metadata about those identities. Then we generally have an identity broker. And the job of this identity broker is to take requests from the identities or the applications and run those up against the identity store. Sometimes we have something called federation. And this is where the identity broker can reach out to other identity providers, such as Facebook or Google or Cognito. Once the identity broker is able to make a positive match, generally they'll return some sort of token or key. And that key then lets the identity access the service it was trying to access in the first place. Let's take a closer look at a typical flow. In this case, it's a SAML flow. We start with the user agent. It could be a user, it could be a service, or an IoT device. They're going to ask the service provider, give me access. And the service provider says, go ask identity provider. And so the user agent turns around and says, I was sent here by the service provider. And the identity provider says, give me some authentication. The user agent would supply that authentication. Maybe it's in the form of a password or a SSL certificate. The identity provider checks that authentication and says, yep, this person's good, let them in. Then the service provider says, okay, come on in. Now I wanted to spend a little bit of time comparing SAML, OAuth, and OpenID. And these are three things that you'll hear a lot about when we talk about federated security models. First, SAML can be thought of as kind of the original protocol for security federation. It can handle both authorization and authentication. It's XML-based, and it can contain user, group, member information. It's very extensible, and it's really best suited for single sign-on for enterprise users. OAuth is a little bit different. It allows us to share protected assets without having to send and receive login credentials. And it handles authorization only, not authentication. Generally, it issues a token to the client, and the client uses that token as a sort of pass to interact with the services. It's a sort of delegation, allowing the client to access information on behalf of the user. And generally, it's best suited for API authorizations between applications. OpenID Connect is a bit more sophisticated. It adds a layer on top of OAuth that also includes authentication. And it uses REST and JSON message flows. And it supports a lot of different clients, including web clients, mobile. There's even a JavaScript client. And it's very extensible. And it's really best suited for single sign-on for public customers. OpenID Connect is used in a lot of public-facing, consumer-grade mobile applications. Now, AWS has spent a lot of time and energy on being sure they're certified to a wide variety of standards. A lot of these standards just represent the fact that Amazon has implemented a lot of security controls and processes to be sure that they keep our data safe. Now you can find all sorts of supporting documentation and various compliance reports within AWS Artifact from the AWS console. Now, to download some of the material, you do need to acknowledge some conditions, like maybe a non-disclosure agreement. So be sure to check with your legal or compliance team before you go accepting a lot of click-through agreements.